Did you know that, in the 21st century, there are still places in the world where dog meat is consumed as a delicacy? It may seem unbelievable, but this practice continues to be part of the culture of some countries, provoking polarized reactions around the globe. For many, dogs are loyal friends, part of the family, but for others, they are seen as a source of food and, in some cases, a traditional medicine. This reality, so far from what we are used to, goes beyond simple cultural clashes. It raises profound questions about ethics, tradition, and survival. And today, you will be surprised to discover more about these curiosities from countries where this practice is still common and controversial. Did you know that, in some parts of the world, eating dog meat is still a common practice? At first, this idea may shock you. After all, in the West, dogs are our faithful companions, true members of the family. But in other cultures, dogs have a different role. Curiosities about countries are a great way to open discussions, and this topic certainly raises many questions. We tend to think that what is familiar to us is right, but the world is much bigger than that. Let's explore this topic with respect, because there is much more behind this practice than you might think. In many cultures around the world, ancient traditions remain strong even if they face resistance. Eating dog meat for some is deeply rooted in their histories and ways of life. Curiosity from country to country makes us realize that, often, what causes us strangeness is a fundamental part of the survival of other nations. Imagine a time of scarcity, where resources are limited and every choice is a matter of life and death. In these circumstances, what is seen as a pet in some places may have a completely different meaning in others. Our goal here is not to judge, but to understand. Often, when we learn about these curiosities about countries, we broaden our view of the world. Have you ever stopped to think about how traditions can stay alive, even in such a connected and globalized world? In some countries, the consumption of dog meat has roots in deep beliefs, and these practices continue despite all the awareness movement. But are we ready to face these differences with empathy? Throughout this video, we will dive headfirst into this topic, with an open mind and a heart willing to learn. But before we start exploring the details, we need to remember that cultures are built over centuries. It's not just about tastes or preferences, but about how a society is structured and survives. By understanding the origins of these traditions, we are better prepared to reflect on the changes that are to come. The practice of consuming dog meat did not arise by chance. It dates back to very ancient times when people needed to make difficult choices to ensure their survival. In some regions of the world, especially in Asia and parts of Africa, dogs were seen very differently than we are used to in the West. Curiosity from country to country reveals that in times of scarcity, these animals were an important source of protein. It was a matter of necessity, not preference. Societies adapted to what was available, and what repulses us today was vital for them. These customs are deeply linked to the history of nomadic peoples. On their long and arduous journeys, there was no room for sentimental differentiations with animals. Dogs were useful both for protection and for food when necessary. Curiosity about countries like Mongolia or China leads us to understand that the relationship with these animals was practical and functional, without the emotional bond that modernity brought us. It was a fair exchange. Dogs protected families, and ultimately, they could be used as food, ensuring everyone's survival. Over time, these practices became cultural traditions. Even with the advancement of agriculture and the domestication of other animals for consumption, dog meat continued to be part of the diet in several regions. It is interesting to note that, in some cases, it even acquired a symbolic value. In Vietnam, for example, consuming dog meat is believed to bring strength and energy, a belief that still persists today. This curiosity about countries that maintain these ancient traditions is a reminder of how history shapes a people's customs. Although the modern world has begun to question many of these practices, their historical origins make us reflect on how much survival shapes culture. By understanding where this practice comes from, we are able to understand the nuances of each society without judging only from the current perspective. And this prepares us for the next stage of our journey, understanding how these cultural differences manifest themselves today. In the West, dogs are seen as members of the family, loyal companions who share the sofa, the bed, and even the most important moments in life with us. But curiosity about countries in other regions shows us that this vision is far from universal. In many places, especially in Asia, dogs are viewed differently, and this is deeply rooted in cultural and historical issues. What seems absurd to us is, for other cultures, a common and often necessary practice. And this is one of the great lessons about cultural diversity. What is natural in one place can be completely strange in another. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to grow up in a society where dogs don't have the same emotional value that we are used to giving them. In some parts of the world, dogs are seen more as utilities, part of a survival system. Curiosities from country to country reveal how, historically, the role of animals in communities has always been adapted to the needs of that group. While in the West, they have gained the status of companions, in other regions, their function remains more practical, both for work and food. What makes this issue so delicate is the difference in perception. For us, who have dogs as faithful friends, the idea of eating them sounds cruel. But when we look from a broader perspective, we begin to see that local traditions and realities shape these choices. Curiosity from country to country reveals these profound distinctions. After all, if we think about it, it's not very different from how we in the West deal with other farmed animals. For many who keep cattle or pigs as pets, our practice of eating them would be equally shocking. This cultural dilemma leads us to reflect on the role of animals in societies and how these differences affect our view of the world. And it is precisely in this plurality of traditions that we begin to understand that before making any judgment, we need to look at the history and context behind these practices. Next, we will explore the economic factor that also influences this issue and how it has a significant impact on the choices of those who consume dog meat. When we talk about the consumption of dog meat in some countries, we cannot ignore the impact that the economy has on this practice. Often, what seems like a controversial choice to us is, in fact, a question of survival for populations living in conditions of extreme poverty. Curiosity about countries shows us that, in times of scarcity, access to meat of any kind can be limited, and dogs end up becoming a viable source of food. It's the harsh reality faced by millions of people around the world, where necessity speaks louder than tradition. Imagine a society where agriculture and livestock farming are practically non-existent, and food resources are scarce. Under these conditions, the cost of meat from animals such as cows or pigs is too high for most families. Curiosity from country to country reveals that in some regions, especially in Asia and Africa, dogs are becoming a more accessible option, both in terms of availability and cost. These communities often do not have the luxury of choosing what to eat, and dog meat may be the only viable alternative to ensure necessary nutrition. Furthermore, the dog meat trade often operates in informal markets, where supervision is minimal and costs are low. The lack of regulation in these markets contributes to the perpetuation of the practice, especially in rural and peripheral areas. The consumption of dog meat in these cases is not a preference, but an imposition of local economic reality. It's a curiosity about countries that makes us reflect on how social inequality and poverty shape the relationship between people and animals. transforming what would be an unusual practice into a necessity. Looking at this scenario, we realize that the economy has a huge influence on the food choices of each culture. It's not just about tradition or taste, but about adapting to circumstances. And it is precisely this combination of economic and cultural factors that keeps the consumption of dog meat alive in certain parts of the world. But, beyond the economy, there is a specific region where this practice stands out: East Asia. Let's dive into this next topic to understand how these traditions remain strong in countries like China, South Korea, and Vietnam. When we talk about dog meat consumption, we cannot ignore East Asia. It is in this region that the practice is most evidently concentrated, with countries such as China, South Korea, and Vietnam gaining prominence. Curiosity about countries in this area reveals that despite growing opposition, the consumption of dog meat is a tradition that has stood the test of time. The Yulin Festival in China, for example, attracts global attention for the controversy it generates. But for locals, it is seen as part of a cultural ritual. What for many sounds like cruelty, for others is a celebration of traditions. In South Korea, dog meat consumption also has deep roots. Bosintang, a soup made with dog meat, is considered a traditional dish, especially among the older population. However, new generations are beginning to question this practice, influenced by contact with Western cultures and the increasing adoption of dogs as pets. The curiosity from country to country shows how the country itself is divided on this issue, with many young South Koreans opposing the practice, while a part of the older population still defends it as a symbol of strength and vitality. Vietnam, in turn, has a symbolic relationship with dog meat, seen as a food that brings luck and prosperity, especially at the end of the lunar month. For many Vietnamese, consuming this type of meat is a way to attract good energy. However, as the country modernizes, international and internal pressure grows for this practice to be abolished. Curiosity about countries like Vietnam shows us that, while some traditions begin to weaken, they still have strong support in certain regions and social contexts. Despite global pressure and activist movements, dog meat consumption continues to be a reality in East Asia. Traditions resist, and often the response to opposition is precisely a reinforcement of these practices, seen as part of cultural identity. However, it is interesting to note that resistance is not unanimous. In each of these countries, there are internal divisions, and movements to abolish this practice are gaining strength. Now, let's look more closely at the case of China and the controversial Yulin Festival, which has become one of the biggest symbols of this practice. The Yulin Festival, held in China, is, without a doubt, one of the most controversial events when it comes to the consumption of dog meat. Every year, this celebration attracts the world's attention, generating heated debates and fervent protests. The festival, which takes place on the summer solstice, involves the slaughter and consumption of thousands of dogs and is promoted by its supporters as a cultural tradition. Curiosity from country to country makes us wonder, does this practice really represent a legitimate cultural heritage, or is it just a modern commercial appeal? Many believe that the festival, in fact, has gained recent strength more for economic reasons than for real respect for traditions. The origin of the Yulin Festival is not as old as one might think. It began to be officially promoted in 2009, which led many to question whether it really is a centuries-old tradition or a revived practice to attract tourists and boost the local economy. However, for Yulin residents, the festival is a long-standing celebration, and dog meat is seen as a delicacy that, according to popular beliefs, wards off heat and brings good luck. Curiosity about countries like China reveals these contradictions. A festival that, although recent, is rooted in popular beliefs and still finds fervent defenders among the local population. The festival, however, does not pass without resistance. Within China itself, animal rights activists have mobilized to end the practice. Some Chinese citizens oppose the event and the cruelty involved in the slaughter of the dogs, which has generated intense debate about the need for change. The country is divided, with a growing number of Chinese adopting dogs as pets and rejecting the idea of eating them. This shows how cultural traditions are constantly changing, and how curiosity from country to country reveals internal divisions that we are often unaware of. With increasing international pressure and global campaigns against the festival, many local authorities began taking measures to reduce the event's visibility. However, despite these changes, the Yulin Festival still continues, defying growing global disapproval. This scenario leads us to reflect on the complexity of the issue. To what extent should traditions be maintained or abandoned? And, more importantly, how are new generations dealing with these practices? In South Korea, for example, the clash between tradition and modernity is evident, and we will see this in the next topic. South Korea is experiencing a unique moment of cultural transition. Traditionally, dog meat was consumed somewhat regularly, especially in the form of the dish bosintang, a nutritious soup that many believed increased strength and vitality. However, curiosity from country to country reveals that South Korea, although still maintaining the practice, is gradually moving away from this custom. Younger generations, influenced by globalization and the growing affection for dogs as pets, are openly questioning this tradition. Young South Koreans have adopted an increasingly critical stance towards the consumption of dog meat. Dogs, once seen as utilitarian animals, are now an integral part of families, and new generations have shown repulsion towards the practice of eating them. Pro-animal rights movements have been gaining strength, and social pressure within the country has generated a division between those who defend tradition and those who fight for abolition. Curiosity about countries like South Korea shows us how modernity directly impacts cultural practices, often replacing what was previously widely accepted. But this transition is not simple. The older generation, who grew up in times of scarcity and with a different view of animals, still maintains the practice and believes in the benefits of consuming dog meat. For them, this tradition is not just a matter of taste, but of cultural identity and history of survival. This clash of generations is emblematic in many countries that are modernizing rapidly, such as South Korea. Curiosities from country to country reveal these internal clashes, where the new and the old coexist, not always harmoniously. The cultural transformation in South Korea is clear evidence that over time, customs can change radically. Although the practice still exists, it is clearly losing ground to the growing westernized view that dogs are friends, not food. This movement of change, however, is not exclusive to South Korea. In Vietnam, there is a deep relationship between dog meat and traditional beliefs, which we will explore in the next topic. In Vietnam, dog meat occupies a curious place between tradition and popular belief. Many Vietnamese believe that this type of meat has medicinal properties and is associated with vitality and good luck. It's a curiosity about countries that makes us reflect on how food can carry such strong cultural and spiritual meanings. The consumption of dog meat, for example, is especially common in the last days of the lunar month, when it is believed to bring fortune for the next cycle. Thus, what for some is just food, for others it carries an important symbolic weight. In addition to superstition, there is also belief in folk medicine. In Vietnam, dog meat is seen as a medicine that warms the body and strengthens vital energy, a belief that dates back centuries of traditions. Many still believe that consuming this meat can provide health benefits, especially in cold weather, when it is consumed to warm the body. Curiosity from country to country makes us understand how, in some cultures, food is not just a matter of nutrition, but of healing and spiritual protection. However, like many other Asian countries, Vietnam is undergoing a transformation. With increased contact with the West and the growing influence of modernity, new Vietnamese generations have distanced themselves from these traditions. Young activists, international organizations, and even tourists have been pressing the government to abolish the practice, arguing that it no longer has a place in a modern society. This creates an interesting division within the country. On one side, defenders of traditions, and on the other, those who see dogs as companions, not food. This changing scenario is far from simple, and Vietnam continues to face challenges regarding dog meat consumption. While some continue to believe in their healing powers, others now see dogs as part of their families, pushing for changes in laws and culture. Just like Vietnam, other Asian countries are also experiencing this conflict between old and new, as we will see when exploring practices in the Philippines and Indonesia. In the Philippines and Indonesia, the consumption of dog meat was also, for many years, part of the cultural reality, although today it is in decline. In the Philippines, the habit was introduced during colonial occupation, and in rural areas, dog meat is still consumed, mainly for economic reasons. Curiosity about countries like the Philippines reveals that for some more isolated populations, the practice persists as a food alternative in times of need. However, modernization and increasing urbanization have changed this reality, bringing new values and the influence of animal protection movements. Indonesia, in turn, has a more complex relationship with the consumption of dog meat. Although it is not a prevalent practice throughout the country, in some regions, such as certain islands, dog meat is still consumed in traditional festivities and rituals. Curiosity from country to country shows us how the cultural diversity within Indonesia allows these practices to vary enormously. Despite this, international pressure and growing tourism have influenced public perception, leading to debates about the role of this tradition in a society increasingly connected to the outside world. In recent years, both the Philippines and Indonesia have made legal strides to curb the consumption of dog meat. In 1998, the Philippines passed a law banning the sale and slaughter of dogs for consumption, although enforcement of this legislation still faces challenges. In Indonesia, the debate continues, and in some regions there are already local initiatives to protect dogs. However, as we have seen in other cultures, these practices do not disappear overnight. Curiosity about countries that are in the process of cultural transition reveals how slow this change can be, especially in rural and isolated areas. Although these countries are moving into a new era in which dogs are seen more as companions than food, the transition is gradual and often painful. However, change is underway, and over time, more regions are expected to follow the example of more urbanized areas. Just as in Africa, where the practice is less well known but still present, the relationship between dog meat and survival continues to shape the culture of various societies. Although the consumption of dog meat is most associated with Asia, the practice also exists in some parts of Africa, albeit in a less well-known form. In several regions, especially in Central and West African countries, the consumption of dog meat is deeply rooted in local traditions and conditions of extreme poverty. Curiosity about African countries reveals that for many of these communities, dog meat represents a valuable source of protein in times of scarcity. For these populations, dogs are seen in a practical way, without the emotional bond that is common in other cultures. In countries such as Nigeria and Cameroon, dog meat is consumed mainly in rural areas where access to other meats may be limited. In these regions, consumption is as much a matter of necessity as it is an inherited tradition. In some cultures, the dog is seen as a symbol of protection, and its meat is consumed in rituals to ensure the safety and strength of the community. Curiosity from country to country within Africa shows us how these customs vary from region to region, often going unnoticed in the eyes of the rest of the world. However, just like other parts of the world, Africa is also experiencing change. With economic growth and increasing urbanization, attitudes towards dogs are slowly transforming. In more urban areas, dogs begin to be seen as companion animals, and the consumption of their meat decreases significantly. Western influence and exposure to global animal rights activism have played an important role in this transition. Curiosity about African countries reveals that although the practice still exists, it is increasingly restricted to isolated areas that are difficult to access. Even so, the consumption of dog meat in parts of Africa is still a reality, especially among the poorest communities. Although it is less visible on the global stage, the practice still provokes debate, both inside and outside the continent. As African economies continue to grow and new generations adopt more modern views on the role of animals in society, it is likely that the practice will eventually decline further. Now, let's explore the role of religious beliefs in this issue, as they also strongly influence the consumption of dog meat in various cultures around the world. Religion, throughout history, has played a crucial role in shaping eating habits in various cultures, and the consumption of dog meat is no exception. In some religious traditions, dogs are seen as unclean, while in others, they are considered protective or even sacred. Curiosity about countries with different religious influences shows us how these beliefs shape the way dogs are treated, and in some cases, consumed. For example, in many parts of the Muslim world, the consumption of dog meat is practically non-existent, since Islam views dogs as unclean for close contact, which, in a way, protects these animals. However, in some African and Asian cultures, there are religious and spiritual beliefs that see the consumption of dog meat as a practice loaded with symbolism. In certain regions of Nigeria, for example, it is believed that consuming dog meat can bring spiritual protection and ward off evil spirits. In some traditional cultures in Vietnam and Indonesia, dog meat is seen as a source of vital energy capable of strengthening the body and soul. Curiosity from country to country reveals how local religions strongly influence these eating habits, linking them not only to nutrition, but also to spiritual well-being. Christianity, on the other hand, does not have an explicit prohibition on the consumption of dog meat, although in most Christian countries, dogs are seen more as companions than as food. However, in regions where Christianity mixes with animist beliefs or local traditions, such as in certain parts of Africa, the consumption of dog meat may occur in rituals or as part of traditional festivities. Curiosity about countries that combine religious practices with dietary traditions shows us how complex and diverse these cultural relationships are. It is interesting to see how religious beliefs can both protect dogs and promote their consumption, depending on local interpretation and traditions. This cultural complexity, often unknown in the West, helps us better understand the nuances behind dog meat consumption in different parts of the world. However, regardless of religion or tradition, the global impact on this practice has been intense, especially with growing Western pressure to change these habits, as we will see below in the next topic. The West has reacted quite strongly to the consumption of dog meat in some parts of the world, especially in Asia. This practice is often seen as cruel and unacceptable, sparking a wave of activism and global campaigns to try to abolish the custom. Curiosity about countries that maintain these traditions reveals how the West has largely positioned itself as a defender of animal rights, arguing that dogs should be seen as companions and not as food. This cultural shock is one of the main factors that fuel the heated discussions around the topic. Activist movements and animal protection organizations such as Humane Society International and PETA have been extremely vocal in their opposition to the practice. They frequently run public campaigns, organize protests, and pressure governments to create laws that protect dogs from slaughter. Furthermore, with the power of social media, these movements gained global reach, with millions of people expressing their outrage. Curiosity from country to country shows us how these international pressures can have a direct impact on local policies and practices, forcing changes that might not otherwise come naturally. However, the Western reaction has also generated resistance in some countries where the practice is still common. For many, international pressure is seen as an attempt to impose foreign cultural values, which awakens a feeling of defending one's own cultural identity. In some cases, this cultural imperialism is rejected, and local traditions end up being reinforced as an act of resistance to Western interference. This curiosity about countries that resist external pressure helps us understand how the dynamics between tradition and modernity can be complex and often conflicting. Despite these tensions, the global impact is undeniable. As international campaigns gain momentum, more countries are reviewing their policies regarding dog meat consumption. The Chinese government itself, for example, has already indicated that dogs should be considered companion animals, which represents a significant step towards protecting these animals. The West continues to pressure, but will this change be enough to truly transform this practice globally? The industry behind dog meat consumption is still a powerful force, as we will see in the next topic. Behind the consumption of dog meat, there is an organized industry that involves breeding, transporting, and selling these animals, often operating outside of legality. Curiosity about countries that still maintain this practice reveals a complex network that supports the dog meat trade, especially in informal markets. This trade is particularly strong in China, South Korea, and Vietnam, where dogs are bred specifically for food or captured off the streets, fueling a demand that persists despite pressure to end the habit. The slaughter of dogs in clandestine markets is a reality that is difficult to ignore. In rural areas, the dog meat trade usually takes place in local markets, where hygiene conditions and animal welfare are often neglected. Transporting these animals to slaughter is cruel, with dogs being kept in terrible conditions, crammed into cages, and without access to adequate water or food. Curiosity from country to country shows us how, in some cases, this practice is sustained amid a lack of supervision and poverty, which makes it difficult to apply stricter laws. The illegal trade in dogs, especially those captured from the streets or even stolen from families, is still a growing concern. The sale of dog meat also extends to restaurants and festivals, where the dish is served in social and cultural contexts. Although the practice is declining in urban areas, there are still many establishments that offer dog meat as a delicacy. Curiosity about countries where the consumption of dog meat is common makes us realize how the trade is maintained by solid demand, both from older consumers who defend traditions and from tourists looking to try something exotic. This cultural factor contributes to the continuation of trade, despite global campaigns against the practice. It is important to note that in many of these countries, the dog meat trade is facing increasing siege, with governments introducing regulations and restricting the practice in more visible areas. However, the road to completely eradicating this industry is still long, especially in rural and isolated areas where enforcement is limited. This reality leads us to reflect on the ethical and moral implications of consuming dog meat. And this is what we will explore in the next topic, as the discussion about animal rights intensifies. The issue of dog meat consumption cannot be separated from the discussion on animal rights. For many people around the world, especially in the West, dogs are seen as sentient beings, deserving of protection and respect. Curiosity about countries where the consumption of dog meat is still common makes us reflect on the abyss that exists between different cultural and moral perspectives. While in some places these animals are seen as food, in others they are treated as members of the family. This difference highlights an ethical discussion that challenges our view of what is acceptable or not. The debate on animal rights goes beyond cultural borders. Organizations such as PETA and Humane Society International advocate that all animals, regardless of species, deserve to be treated with dignity, which includes ending the practice of eating dog meat. It is argued that dogs, due to their companionable nature and their ability to form emotional bonds with humans, should not be slaughtered for consumption. Curiosity from country to country reveals how this perspective is increasingly adopted, especially as animal rights activism grows around the world. However, resistance to this view is also strong. For many communities where eating dog meat is a long-standing tradition, this pressure is seen as a form of cultural imperialism, in which foreign values are imposed on local practices. Defenders of tradition argue that each culture has the right to preserve its own ways of living, as long as it is done in a respectful manner. Curiosity about countries that maintain these traditions reveals that for some, the slaughter of dogs for consumption is seen in a similar way to the slaughter of pigs or chickens in the West, questioning the hierarchy of value we attribute to species. This ethical and moral discussion is far from being resolved, but it raises important questions about how far respect for traditions should go, especially when it involves the well-being of living beings. As the global animal rights movement continues to gain momentum, the dilemma persists. To what extent should traditions be maintained in a world that increasingly values the ethical treatment of animals? The answer, perhaps, lies in the way the media has approached the topic, bringing to light the realities behind this practice, as we will see in the next topic. The media plays a key role in how dog meat consumption is perceived around the world. In recent years, documentaries, reports, and advertising campaigns have exposed the often brutal conditions in which dogs are raised, transported, and slaughtered. Curiosity about countries where this practice is still common sparks global interest, fueled by media coverage that brings these realities to light. The shocking images of dog meat markets and stories of dog rescues create a deep emotional impact for both activists and the general public. This media coverage also contributed to increasing pressure on the governments of these countries. By showcasing practices on international platforms, the media generates a global response that often leads to action. Protests, online petitions, and awareness campaigns are intensifying as more people become informed about the issue. Curiosity from country to country shows how the impact of social networks is undeniable. Photos, videos, and stories shared en masse manage to raise awareness among millions of people around the world, creating a global activism network that fights for dogs' rights. On the other hand, the role of the media is also critical when it comes to preserving cultural traditions. In some regions, the consumption of dog meat is treated respectfully, with an emphasis on the historical and cultural reasons behind the practice. There are programs that seek to explain, and not just criticize, the context in which this practice developed. Curiosity about countries that defend their traditions shows us that the media often needs to balance the narrative, presenting both sides of the coin so that the debate is fair and informative. Even so, the emotional impact often speaks louder than cultural understanding. With the power to shape public opinion, the media has been a major force in transforming global perceptions of dog meat consumption. However, the real impact of media coverage depends on the ability of local countries to react to this international pressure and change their practices. The exposure generated by these articles has already led some governments to take stricter measures, but as we will see in the next topic, these legal changes are not always enough to eradicate the practice once and for all. In response to growing international pressure and local activist movements, some countries have begun to implement significant legal changes to ban, or at least reduce the consumption of dog meat. Curiosity about countries that still maintain this practice shows us that, despite the laws advancing, the cultural transition and the application of rules do not always happen quickly. Countries like the Philippines, for example, have already implemented laws that prohibit the sale and slaughter of dogs for consumption. But in rural areas, this legislation still faces barriers to being effectively applied. In China, although there is no national ban, some cities have taken local measures to reduce the dog meat trade. Shenzhen and Zhuhai, for example, were the first to implement direct bans, positioning themselves as progressive cities regarding animal rights. These changes are a sign that China, like many other countries, is open to modernizing its food practices, even if the road is long. Curiosity from country to country shows us that these legal changes are often driven by the desire to improve the global image and attract foreign investment, which reinforces the importance of external pressures. In South Korea, the discussion about banning the consumption of dog meat is in full swing. In 2018, the South Korean government closed the country's largest dog slaughterhouse, which was seen as a significant step forward in the fight against this practice. However, curiosity about countries facing this legal dilemma reveals that even with specific actions, the dog meat trade still persists in clandestine markets and local festivals. The fight for complete abolition comes up against cultural issues and the resistance of older generations who still see the practice as part of their heritage. Despite these initiatives, the path to completely eradicating dog meat consumption is complex and depends not only on legal changes but also on a profound cultural transformation. Laws are just the first step. A joint effort between government, society, and NGOs is needed to ensure that these rules are complied with and that the practice truly disappears. This social progress, however, is already in motion, and perceptions about dogs are changing, as we will see in the next topic. Over the past few decades, the way dogs are viewed in various parts of the world has changed drastically. What was once a purely utilitarian relationship, with dogs being used for work or consumption, is slowly transforming into a more emotional and effective connection. Curiosity about countries in the process of modernization reveals that, just as happened in the West, many nations in Asia and Africa are adopting the view of dogs as life companions. This change is particularly evident among younger generations who tend to see dogs as friends and family members, influenced by globalization and the popularization of Western culture. Social media has played a crucial role in this evolution, bringing heartwarming stories of dog rescues and promoting the idea of adoption. In countries like South Korea and Vietnam, it is increasingly common to see dogs being treated as part of the household, walking with their owners in the streets and frequenting cafes and parks dedicated to pets. Curiosity from country to country shows us that this trend, although growing, still faces resistance in more traditional areas. But it is already a strong indication that the perception about dogs is changing for the better. This new view of dogs as members of families is leading to an increase in the adoption of these animals, especially among young adults. Non-governmental organizations and local activist groups have been working hard to promote adoption over culling. This has generated a significant transformation in many communities, which now see the value of dogs as loyal companions and not as a source of food. Curiosity about countries like China, where dog adoption has grown, reveals that this change is in full swing, despite the traditions that still persist. This social progress makes us believe that over time, the consumption of dog meat could become a practice of the past. Although the tradition is still strong in some regions, the new generation is, little by little, changing this perception. The bond between humans and dogs grows stronger as more people recognize the emotional value of these animals. And, while this transformation occurs, Cultural tourism also plays an important role in challenging these traditions, as we will see in the next topic. Cultural tourism has played an interesting role in the way the practice of dog meat consumption is viewed and questioned. Visitors to Western countries, where dogs are considered companions and part of the family, are often shocked to come across markets or festivals where dog meat is sold. This curiosity about countries that maintain these traditions can be a real cultural shock for tourists, who often don't know how to react when witnessing something so far from their reality. This experience sometimes generates discomfort and provokes discussions about how far respect for culture should go. Many tourists feel torn between the desire to respect local traditions and the moral impulse to criticize something that seems unacceptable to them. When visiting places like Yulin in China or small rural markets in Vietnam, tourists are confronted with a reality that challenges their own beliefs. Curiosity from country to country reveals to us that, while some choose to stay away, others choose to get involved, participating in awareness movements or supporting local NGOs that fight for animal rights. This involvement often creates a positive impact, showing locals that there are other ways to interact with dogs besides consumption. Furthermore, cultural tourism has also contributed to changing mentalities in some communities. The growing presence of tourists and the impact of globalization are helping to transform perceptions about dogs in many of these countries. In places where tourism is a large source of income, such as parts of Indonesia and Thailand, feedback from visitors has encouraged some restaurants to stop serving dog meat and instead adopt more tourist-friendly practices. Curiosity about countries with strong tourism reveals that in this context, contact with visitors from abroad can be a catalyst for cultural change. However, this culture clash also raises the question of to what extent tourism can influence local traditions without seeming like an imposition. Although contact with other cultures helps to sensitize local populations to new ideas, it is essential that this transformation occurs organically, without forcing abrupt changes that could generate resistance. Tourism can be an agent of change, but it must be treated with care and respect. On the other hand, while tourism helps shape this new perception, defenders of tradition still continue to make their voices heard, as we will see in the next topic. Amid international criticism and pressure, there are those who defend the consumption of dog meat as a fundamental part of their traditions and cultural identities. For these advocates, the practice is not just a food issue, but a symbolic element that dates back centuries of history and customs. Curiosity about countries that resist change makes us realize that for many, the consumption of dog meat is deeply rooted in rituals, celebrations, and even notions of survival. It is seen as part of the natural cycle of life, in the same way that the consumption of other animals is for other cultures. Defenders of this tradition argue that the West, in condemning the practice, applies a selective moral vision. For them, criticism of dog meat consumption often ignores that, in other parts of the world, the slaughter of cows, pigs, and poultry is equally controversial for certain cultures. Curiosity from country to country shows us how this argument holds up. What for some is unacceptable, for others is a normal part of the diet. This cultural tension between tradition and modernity is central to the debate, especially in regions that see Western pressure as a threat to their cultural sovereignty. Furthermore, there is a strong feeling that this international interference constitutes a form of cultural imperialism, where Western values are imposed on societies with different histories and realities. In countries like South Korea and Vietnam, where the practice is more common, advocates say it is unfair to condemn a tradition that dates back centuries, especially when the practice is linked to periods of scarcity and poverty. Curiosity about countries that maintain their traditions despite criticism reveals how this resistance is often a symbol of national identity and resistance to globalization. This defense of traditions, however, is not unanimous and is in decline, especially among younger generations who are more open to global influences and ethical questions about the treatment of animals. Still, advocates of the practice continue to fight to keep its traditions alive, arguing that, if carried out in a humane and controlled manner, the consumption of dog meat is as valid as the consumption of any other animal. However, while these advocates seek to preserve the tradition, there are moving stories of dog rescues that have touched many people's hearts deeply, as we will see in the next topic. Over the years, several moving stories of rescuing dogs destined for slaughter have gained international attention, touching the hearts of millions of people. Curiosity about countries where these rescues take place reveals the profound impact that these stories can have on the way society views the practice of consuming dog meat. One of the most emblematic cases took place in South Korea, where animal rights NGOs managed to rescue hundreds of dogs from one of the country's largest slaughterhouses, closing its doors permanently. The case generated worldwide repercussions and put even more pressure on authorities to regulate trade. These rescues are often led by local activists in partnership with international organizations. One example is the Humane Society International, which has been actively working in countries such as China, Vietnam, and South Korea to free dogs from slaughterhouses and ensure they find loving homes. Curiosity from country to country reveals to us how these rescue operations have become symbols of hope and change. Many of these dogs are taken to the West, where they are adopted by families who treat them with the affection and respect they deserve, creating a bridge of empathy between cultures. These dogs' stories of overcoming challenges also have transformative power. Each dog rescued represents a victory against the system that exploits them, and their journeys to recovery inspire many to join the cause for animal rights. In documentaries and media campaigns, these dogs are shown adapting to new lives, overcoming trauma, and discovering human love and care. Curiosity about countries that embrace these initiatives shows us how these stories can sensitize even those who, initially, defended the tradition of eating dog meat. These rescue cases, in addition to saving lives, also play a key role in educating and mobilizing the public. Through social media and traditional media, these stories of resilience have helped change public perception, creating a global movement pushing for the complete abolition of the dog meat trade. However, for these changes to really happen, it is necessary to offer viable alternatives to replace this practice, as we will see in the next topic. With increasing international pressure and growing awareness about animal rights, many countries have been looking for alternatives to replace the consumption of dog meat. One of the most effective strategies has been the promotion of conventional meats, such as chicken and pork, to those who traditionally consume dog meat. Curiosity about countries that have implemented these changes shows us how, in some cases, the transition is facilitated by education and awareness campaigns, which present these alternatives as more viable and ethical options. The change in habits, although slow, is starting to gain strength in urban areas, where Western influence is more present. In addition to food alternatives, some initiatives have encouraged the adoption of dogs as companion animals, instead of seeing them as food. Adoption programs promoted by local and international NGOs offer a sustainable solution, showing communities that dogs can play different roles in their lives. Curiosity from country to country reveals that, as people begin to establish emotional bonds with these animals, the idea of consuming them becomes increasingly distant. In countries like South Korea, where dog adoption is growing, this transformation is visible in younger generations. Restaurants and merchants that once relied on selling dog meat are also finding new ways to adapt. In some regions, especially in China, some establishments are reinventing themselves, offering traditional dishes with alternative meats, but maintaining the same culinary base. This allows cultural traditions to be preserved while promoting ethical change. Curiosity about countries that are adopting these alternatives shows us that over time, it is possible to find a balance between cultural preservation and animal welfare without breaking the identity of local communities. Although alternatives are taking hold, there is still much to be done to ensure that the practice of consuming dog meat is gradually replaced by these new options. Awareness-raising movements, government support, and the crucial role of NGOs are fundamental to this process. The hope is that, over time, these alternatives will gain more space and the practice of slaughtering dogs for consumption will finally be a tradition that becomes history. But for this to happen, we need to look to the future and imagine a world where this practice is just a memory of the past, as we will see in our last topic. The future of dog meat consumption appears to be constantly changing as the world becomes more connected and aware of the ethical issues surrounding this practice. Curiosity about countries that still maintain this tradition leads us to reflect on how much cultures can change over time, especially when they are influenced by global movements and new generations. The trend is that, with modernization and social pressure, the consumption of dog meat will continue to decline until it becomes an isolated practice in rural and more remote areas, or even disappears completely in some parts of the world. The new generations, especially in countries like South Korea, China, and Vietnam, have played a crucial role in this change of mentality. Young people are increasingly connected to the outside world, adopting values that promote respect and care for dogs as life companions. Curiosity from country to country shows us that, although this cultural transition will take time, it is already in full swing, with more people choosing to adopt dogs instead of seeing them as food. This movement, driven by awareness campaigns, is one of the biggest signs that the future of dog meat consumption is changing. However, as we have seen throughout this journey, this change will not be rapid or uniform. Traditions have deep roots, and in some communities, the consumption of dog meat is still associated with issues of survival and cultural identity. It will take a joint effort between governments, NGOs, activists, and communities themselves to ensure that this transformation occurs in a sustainable and respectful way. Curiosity about countries facing this dilemma reveals to us that the solution lies in the balance between preserving culture and ensuring animal welfare. Looking to the future, there is hope that, over time, the consumption of dog meat will become just a page in history. A practice that, like many others over the centuries, has been surpassed by the cultural and ethical evolution of humanity. The role of each of us is to continue promoting awareness, respecting cultural differences, but without forgetting the importance of protecting those who do not have a voice to defend themselves. And with that, we end our journey through these curiosities about countries, leaving the way open for new reflections and changes to happen.
Hey explorers, if you love discovering the amazing curiosities and stories we share here on Exploring Nations, how about supporting the channel with just $1? This small gesture can make a big difference and is essential to keep this content going. Without your support, our journey might be cut short. And there's more. When you shop on Amazon, use our special link. It costs you nothing extra, plus you get an exclusive discount and it helps us out a lot. The links for donations and Amazon are pinned in the first comment. Don't let this adventure stop, we're counting on you. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and drop us a comment.